Hello, this short webinar is titled Separation of Church and State, Part 4, New Political Doctrine Created by Unelected Judges. And this is a quick study. It takes a look at 4 key court cases that changed everything. To have a proper context to understand those court cases, though, we need to begin with the founding documents of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Founding Fathers, and their sentiments on the intersection of faith, government and public expressions, and where true Republican principles come from, and that's Republican, i.e. Republic, not Republican Party. Noah Webster said this: the brief exposition of the Constitution of the United States will unfold to young persons the principles of Republican, again that's Republic, government. And it's the sincere desire of the writer that our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct Republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion. So in essence what he's saying here is, in order to understand correctly the principles on which the U.S. government was founded upon, it behooves the student to understand biblical principles, and particularly some of the concepts in the New Testament. How did the Supreme Court view this for the first 170 years of our nation's existence? Well, over 100 years after the Constitution was written and approved, the Supreme Court in 1892 said this: our laws and institutions must necessarily be based upon and embody the teachings of the Redeemer of mankind. It is impossible that it should be otherwise. And in this sense, and to this extent, our civilization and our institutions are emphatically Christian. United States Supreme Court, 1892. How about in 1931? We are a Christian people, according to one another, the equal right of religious freedom, and acknowledge with reverence the duty of obedience to the will of God. United States Supreme Court, 1931. Calvin Coolidge, who was president at the time. The foundations of our society and our government rest so much on the teachings of the Bible that it would be difficult to support them if faith in these teachings would cease to be practically universal in our country. Do you catch the point that President Coolidge was making here? The foundations of our society, our government, rests on the teachings of the Bible, and that it would be difficult to support them, that is, the foundations of society and our government, if faith in these teachings would cease to exist. This is an incredible statement. The Supreme Court in 1952 even was still saying this: we are a religious people and our institutions presuppose a supreme being. However, even though this was said in 1952, things had begun to change, and a different seed and philosophy of government was beginning to be planted in the 1930s with the rise of humanism. In 1933, a group of 34 humanists in the United States defined and enunciated the philosophical and religious principles that seemed to them to be fundamental. They drafted the Humanist Manifesto I, and for this time it was a radical document. On the preface it says this: these men are undoubtedly representative of a large number who are forging a new philosophy out of the materials of the modern world, and we'll see how their new philosophy began to infiltrate the courts. They went on to say this: the time has come for widespread recognition of the radical changes in religious beliefs throughout the modern world. The time has passed for mere revision of traditional attitudes. Science and economic change have disrupted the old beliefs. Religions the world over are under the necessity of coming to terms with new conditions created by a vastly increased knowledge and experience. In every field of human activity, the vital movement is now in the direction of a candid and explicit humanism. And in every field of human activity means particularly civil government and the institutions of civil power. These seeds that were planted in the 1930s and were watered into the 40s produced a first court decision in 1947 that was different than any other court decision ever in the United States of America. In 1947, Everson versus the Board of Education, the doctrine of separation of church and state was created. The court said this: the First Amendment has erected a wall between church and state. That wall must be kept high and impregnable. We could not approve of its slightest breach. Well, as you know, if you've been following through this series, and you know where the phrase separation of church and state comes from, a letter from Thomas Jefferson, and he was quoting a Baptist minister, Roger Williams, and even Jefferson's remarks squared with the Constitution. The court here has taken those words and created a whole new political philosophy by twisting Jefferson's words to mean the exact opposite of what he intended. Because they had to manipulate their justification for their ruling so much, they did this without citing any precedents. The reason they didn't cite any precedents is because the court created its own political doctrine. No precedents had existed. Well, they made this precedent-breaking statement in philosophy, and the courts did not immediately pick up this new political philosophy. In fact, in 1958, in Baer versus Morgan, the justices even point out that this is a false political doctrine. The court said this: much has been written in recent years concerning Thomas Jefferson's reference in 1802 to a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson's figure of speech has received so much attention that one would almost think at times that it's to be found somewhere in the Constitution. They're basically saying that if the court keeps using this phrase over and over again, people will begin to believe that it's in the Constitution. Well, if we look back in the early part of the 20th century, many had embraced the writings of William James, who had been considered by many to be the father of modern psychology, and he said this: there's nothing so absurd, but if you repeat it often enough, people will believe it. And the court saw that in society, this phrase, the wall of separation of church and state, was being repeated often enough and was being given a wrong interpretation that it was going to be problematic. Indeed, the court was prophetic, because it became problematic in 1962. In 1962, Engel versus Vitale, the Supreme Court began to act on this new political doctrine that had been created. Voluntary school prayer was banned. A verbal prayer offered in a school is unconstitutional, the court said, even if it's both voluntary and denominationally neutral. It's interesting to note that not one legal precedent was cited. Again, that was the case because there was no precedent to cite. This court ruling overturned over 340 years of educational history in the U.S., 170 years under the Constitution. For 170 years, what the students had been doing in schools was not unconstitutional. Without citing any precedent, the Supreme Court overturned this history. It's worth noting that by doing so, the court was in essence saying they had a superior knowledge of what the Founding Fathers had in mind than the Founders did themselves. They also were saying that they had superior knowledge above what all the other courts before them had said. How could such absurd decision occur? Well, perhaps the answer rests in the fact that 8 of the 9 justices that were serving on the Supreme Court at this time had an extended history of political experience, but not judicial experience. Historian D. Barton says this: as a result, the justices who took an oath of office to uphold the Constitution did not fulfill this oath. These justices were determined to make the nation's policy reflect their own personal and philosophical views. By sheer judicial force, they introduced a foreign doctrine and a brand new political philosophy into society. Well, it's interesting to pause here for you, the listener, to take a look at a simple definition of tyranny. A simple definition is the arbitrary exercise of power, which, if you look at how this court case was conducted and executed without citing any precedent, you can surely come to the conclusion that this was power exercised arbitrarily. In our society today, many people do not think of tyranny or see tyranny because in society today it does not start with physical harm to people, but we can miss the signs of tyranny when they are subtle, and we miss this definition, which is the arbitrary exercise of power when an institution or a government agency does not have that power. James Madison, chief architect of the Constitution, said this when government agencies or courts act in this way. He says, attempts to so enforce acts obnoxious to so great a proportion of citizens tend to enervate the laws in general and to slacken the bands of society. Well, enervate means to destroy the strength and vitality thereof. In other words, what Madison is saying is attempts to enforce laws that are obnoxious to a great portion of the citizens promotes disrespect for law, for government, and for institutions. This in turn promotes lawlessness because the people are being ruled against their will. Well, less than a year later, the court continued on in its butchering of the First Amendment, and voluntary Bible reading at school was banned. To this point, schools had classes on the Bible as an historical book and a foundational book of Western culture, and that began to cease. Well, to touch base on another key court decision, in 1980, in Stone versus Graham, the Ten Commandments were ruled unconstitutional as a display. The court said this: it's unconstitutional for the Ten Commandments to hang on the walls of a classroom, since the students might be led to read them, meditate upon them, respect them, or obey them. At the bottom of these Ten Commandment displays was the notation which read this: the secular application of the Ten Commandments is clearly seen in its adoption as the fundamental legal code of Western civilization and the common law of the United States. The copies of the Ten Commandments were purchased with money from private contributions, and yet the court still said this was an illegal activity. Well, that's where the Supreme Court has left us with those four decisions. As I close, let me again state some quotes that we've been using in this series. Had the people during the Revolution had a suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, just not any one sect. In this age, there can be no substitute for Christianity that, in its general principles, is the great conservative element on which we must rely for the purity and permanence of our free institutions. The House Judiciary Committee, 1854. George Washington in his inaugural address. His first remarks: no people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. And he went on to say that he could never believe that the people of the United States would ever forget this, because God's activity was so pronounced. And then lastly, let me conclude again with this quote from Coolidge that made it clear that without these foundations of biblical teachings as a reference point for how those things inform the foundations of our society and our government ideas and philosophies, it would be difficult to support them if faith in these teachings would cease. Here in the beginning of the 21st century, that is in fact where we find ourselves. That faith in these institutions are failing because we removed them from the firm foundation that once existed that supported them. My name's Craig Seibert. Thanks for listening.